I will never forget the night it all began, even though for years I tried to convince myself it was just another anomaly in a career built around secrecy. In 2003, I was 35 years old, flying helicopters under civilian contracts indirectly linked to the government. I didn't wear a military uniform, but I wasn't a regular commercial pilot either. We were what some called grey assets, people whose names could vanish from records if something went wrong. That night, the Nevada desert was unnervingly quiet. No wind, no air traffic. The sky looked like a frozen black dome with no visible stars, as if someone had turned them off one by one. The call came shortly before midnight. No greeting, no context. Prepare for takeoff in 20 minutes, unregistered flight. Destination? I asked. There was a pause. You already know. The line went dead. I didn't push for details. When a name wasn't spoken, it meant it officially didn't exist. Area 51 never appeared on maps, but every pilot in Nevada knew its coordinates by instinct alone. As I put on my helmet and ran through the checklist, a strange pressure settled in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was the sensation of crossing into something without an exit. I took off without a flight plan, without a control tower, without a transponder code. The helicopter moved like a shadow over the dark sand. I flew low, following routes reserved for classified night tests. With every mile, radio signals dropped off one by one, as if the outside world were being switched off behind me. 15 minutes in, my sensors began behaving oddly. They weren't malfunctioning. They were reporting data that made no sense. Sudden thermal fluctuations, movements appearing and vanishing on the radar. I held my breath, waiting for the order to abort the mission. It never came. "Proceed," said an unfamiliar voice through the encrypted channel. That was when I noticed them for the first time. Not directly, but as vague shapes on a secondary display. They weren't vehicles. They weren't animals. They didn't match any known signature. They were clustered forms, small silhouettes moving together, stopping in unison, as if coordinated by something invisible. By protocol, I activated the forward camera. That instinctive, almost automatic decision would later become the reason my life changed forever. I descended a little more. The desert came into view beneath the helicopter's lights, rocks, sand, emptiness, and yet something was undeniably there. I could feel it, a presence that didn't fully register on instruments but was impossible to ignore. I slowed to minimum speed. Then the shapes stopped being shadows. 4 figures, 1 taller, 3 smaller, positioned slightly behind it. They weren't running, they weren't hiding. They stood together, motionless, as if waiting or bracing for something. My throat went dry. I had never been trained for this. I saw no weapons, no aggression. What I recognized instead was a posture that felt disturbingly familiar: protection. The taller figure placed itself just ahead of the others, between them and my aircraft, like a parent, like a guardian. At that moment, the radio erupted into static, a long, piercing tone, then complete silence. I glanced at the cockpit clock. Something felt off. The mission didn't exist on paper, yet time itself seemed to be tracked with unsettling precision. Then it happened. Not a voice, not a sound. A thought, clear, immediate, not my own. "We are not here to be seen." I swallowed hard. The camera was still recording. The helicopter was still hovering. But I knew with a certainty that sent a chill through my spine that I was no longer just observing something classified. I was witnessing something that was never meant to be found. And I understood, without anyone saying a word, that whatever was about to happen in that desert would change how I saw the world forever, and force me to make a decision no pilot should ever have to face. For several seconds, I remained hovering there, suspended between training and instinct. The helicopter's rotors cut through the desert air, yet the figures below did not flinch. No panic, no sudden movement, just stillness. The kind of stillness that feels deliberate, almost respectful. I checked my altitude again. Everything was within limits, yet my hands were sweating inside my gloves. The camera feed was steady now, no longer flickering. Whatever interference had affected the sensors earlier had settled, as if something, or someone, had decided to allow itself to be recorded. I adjusted the zoom. That was when the details became impossible to ignore. Their proportions were not human, but they were not monstrous either. The taller figure was slender, elongated, with movements that felt careful rather than clumsy. The three smaller ones stood close together, slightly behind, mirroring each other's posture. They leaned inward, as children do when they are afraid but trying not to show it. My chest tightened. This was not reconnaissance. This was not surveillance. This felt intrusive. The thermal imaging showed something even stranger. Their body heat was lower than expected but consistent, not mechanical, not artificial, organic, alive. I remember whispering to myself without realizing it. This can't be right. The radio remained silent. No updates, no commands. It was as if I had been temporarily forgotten or deliberately isolated. I tried switching channels manually. Nothing but static. I was alone in the air with whatever was happening on the ground. As I circled slowly, the taller figure tilted its head upward. Directly toward me, I felt my stomach drop. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't random movement. That figure knew exactly where I was, knew I was watching. And in that moment, the distance between observer and observed collapsed completely. I had the overwhelming sensation of being seen. Not just physically, but internally. As if something were scanning intention rather than appearance. My thoughts slowed, became heavy, like moving through thick water. Then came the second message. Again, no sound, no words, just understanding. They are coming. I didn't need clarification. I knew who they were. Military response teams didn't appear on radar until they wanted to be seen. And judging by the timeline, I knew I had very little time before the sky behind me filled with unmarked aircraft. I checked the rear display. Nothing yet. But I knew better than to trust that silence. My training told me to maintain position, keep recording, await orders. My instincts, the part of me that had nothing to do with contracts or protocols, screamed that staying still was the worst possible choice. I lowered the helicopter slightly, angling the lights away from the group. It was a subtle move, one that could be explained later as an adjustment for glare, but the effect was immediate. The smaller figures shifted closer together. The taller one moved again, slowly lifting one arm, not toward me, but backward, as if signaling the others to remain calm. That gesture shattered something inside me. I had seen that motion before, years earlier, during a civilian evacuation after a flood. A father shielding his children from chaos they didn't understand. The memory hit me with such force that I had to steady my breathing. These weren't targets, they weren't assets. They were beings caught in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong sky. The camera continued to record everything. I knew even then that this footage would never be shown publicly, that if it survived at all, it would be buried under layers of classification. But I also knew that once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. A sharp beep cut through the cockpit. Proximity alert. I looked up just in time to catch a faint movement on the horizon, lights approaching fast, low, disciplined, not civilian, not experimental, tactical. They were coming. I hovered there for a final second, torn between obedience and conscience. The taller figure was still watching me, waiting, not for rescue, but for a choice. And in that moment, I realized something terrifyingly clear. Whatever decision I made next would define not only the outcome of this encounter, but who I was going to be for the rest of my life. The approaching lights grew brighter with each passing second. They moved with precision, evenly spaced, cutting through the darkness at a speed that left no doubt about their purpose. I had seen that formation before during joint exercises. There was no mistaking it. This was not a patrol. This was containment. My breathing became shallow. Training tells you to detach, to follow procedure, to remember that hesitation costs lives. But nothing in my training had prepared me for the possibility that the subject below was aware, frightened, and waiting for what I would do next. I checked the fuel gauge. Plenty. I checked the altitude. Stable. Everything about the helicopter said continue mission. Everything inside me said, this is wrong. The taller figure shifted again. This time, it didn't look at me. It looked toward the horizon, toward the incoming lights. The smaller ones reacted instantly, pressing closer together. One of them stumbled slightly, then regained balance with help from the taller one. That was it. That simple, unmistakable act of care erased any remaining illusion that I was witnessing something cold or unknowable. Fear looks the same in every species. Protection does too. The radio crackled back to life. Maintain position. Do not deviate. The voice was calm, professional, final. My mouth went dry. I didn't respond. Instead, I felt something else. A pressure behind my eyes, a tightening in my chest. Thoughts that were not quite thoughts formed and dissolved before I could fully grasp them. Images flashed through my mind. Open sky, rock formations, shadows deep enough to swallow light. I don't claim it was communication in the way we understand it, but it felt like intent brushing against my own. Time is short. I rotated the helicopter slightly, angling my body away from the incoming aircraft. To anyone watching, it would look like a standard correction for wind drift. In reality, I was positioning myself between the family and what was coming. The proximity alert beeped again, louder this time. I knew that once the other helicopters arrived, there would be no room for interpretation. Any unexpected movement on my part would be flagged, logged, questioned. But I also knew something else. They were watching me, not with eyes exactly, but with attention, expectation. I lowered the helicopter a few meters and dimmed the external lights. The desert immediately swallowed most of my outline. Only a faint glow remained, just enough for me to see the ground without fully exposing it. The taller figure reacted instantly. It raised one hand, palm outward, not toward me, but toward the smaller ones, a gesture I recognized from crowd control, from emergency evacuations, from moments when panic had to be contained before it spread. Then it looked back up at me and nodded. I felt a shock run through my spine. That nod wasn't gratitude, it wasn't greeting, it was acknowledgement, as if a line had just been crossed. The first military helicopter appeared on my rear display, then another. Their lights cut through the darkness like knives. I could hear them now, a low, distant thunder that vibrated through my seat. "Confirm visual," the radio commanded. I didn't. Instead, I initiated a shallow lateral drift, just enough to introduce interference into the shared visual field. The maneuver was risky but subtle. To the system, it would register as atmospheric distortion. To anyone watching closely, it would create a blind angle. The figures below moved, not running, not scattering, following. They slipped toward the rocks at the edge of the illuminated area, staying low, staying close. The taller one remained last, never turning its back until the others were partially concealed by shadow. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the rotors. This was no longer observation. This was participation. The radio exploded with overlapping voices. Correct course. Hold position. Do not interfere. I ignored them all. Because in that moment, I understood something with terrifying clarity. Whatever these beings were, they were not invaders. They were refugees. And I had just made myself part of their escape. The moment I committed to that maneuver, there was no turning back. I could feel it in the way the helicopter responded, not mechanically, but psychologically. Every vibration, every tremor in the controls felt louder, sharper, as if the aircraft itself understood the stakes. The desert below was no longer just terrain. It had become a boundary between safety and disappearance. The military helicopters closed in fast. Their formation tightened, disciplined and silent, like predators converging without needing to communicate. I recognized the pattern instantly: containment arc. They weren't searching. They already knew where to look. My headset crackled again. "Last warning, maintain position." I said nothing. Instead, I eased the helicopter lower, drifting toward the rock formations where the shadows grew thick and uneven. The lights from the approaching aircraft swept across the desert floor, cutting bright lines that erased darkness wherever they passed. Each sweep came closer to where the family had taken cover. I glanced down. They were moving faster now, still controlled. But urgency had replaced caution. One of the smaller figures stumbled again. The taller one caught it without hesitation, lifting it slightly, carrying it with an effort that looked strained. That image burned itself into my mind. Whatever they weren't invulnerable. My instruments began to behave erratically once more. Altitude readings fluctuated. The compass spun for half a second before correcting itself. I told myself it was interference from the other aircraft. I needed to believe that. Then the pressure returned. Stronger this time. It felt like standing too close to a powerful engine, except the force wasn't external. It was inside my head. Not painful, just overwhelming. Thoughts slowed. Fear dulled. In its place came a single, unmistakable awareness. They cannot be seen again. I didn't know how I knew that. I just did. The first flare ignited in the distance, a controlled detonation, lighting up the desert in a violent flash of white and orange. Shockwaves rippled across the sand, rolling toward the rock formations. The ground shook beneath the family's feet. One of the smaller figures dropped to the ground, curling inward. My stomach twisted. This was escalating faster than I'd expected. The second flare detonated closer, too close. I pushed the helicopter forward, deliberately breaking formation, placing myself directly between the flares and the rock line. My warning system screamed in protest. I was violating multiple engagement protocols in a matter of seconds. "Identify your intent," a new voice demanded, colder, sharper, higher authority. I opened my mouth to respond and stopped. There was no explanation I could give that wouldn't seal their fate. So I did the only thing left. I killed the forward lights completely. For a brief, terrifying moment, I was flying blind. The helicopter dipped slightly, the horizon vanished, and the only thing guiding me was memory and instinct. Behind me, I heard angry voices flooding the channel. Ahead of me, there was nothing but darkness and trust I didn't know I possessed. The shadows swallowed everything. When I reactivated the lights at minimal intensity, the family was gone. Not hidden, gone. The rock formations were empty, no movement, no heat signatures, no trace of where they had gone or how they had moved so fast. It was as if the desert itself had closed around them. The pressure in my head vanished instantly, leaving behind a hollow calm. The military helicopters swept the area aggressively now, lights flashing, flares firing, rotors churning the air into chaos. I hovered there, frozen, heart racing, waiting for someone to accuse me, to demand answers, to force me down. None came. After several tense minutes, the radio went quiet again. Then a single transmission broke through. "Area secure. Return to base." That was it. No questions, no reprimands, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. I turned the helicopter back toward the base, hands trembling as the desert stretched out beneath me once more. Behind me, the search continued briefly, then stopped, as if something had been intentionally removed from the equation. I didn't feel relief. I felt dread, because whatever had just happened out there had not been an accident. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. The flight back felt longer than the entire mission combined. The desert stretched endlessly beneath me, quiet again, indifferent, as if nothing unusual had occurred. My instruments stabilized. The compass stopped twitching. Every system returned to normal operation, as if whatever interference had existed had simply decided to withdraw. That more than anything unsettled me. When something breaks, you expect damage, errors, evidence. But this was different. It was as if the anomaly had never been there at all. I landed at the auxiliary airstrip just before dawn. No lights guided me in, no ground crew approached. The rotors slowed, then stopped, and the sudden silence felt unnatural after hours of tension. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the controls, listening to my own breathing echo inside the helmet. Two men were waiting when I finally stepped out. They wore no insignia, no ranks, no visible weapons. Their clothes were plain, almost deliberately forgettable. If I had passed them on the street, I would never have noticed them. That, I realized, was the point. "Follow us," one of them said. No greeting, no questions. They led me into a low concrete building near the edge of the strip. Inside, the air was cool and dry, smelling faintly of ozone and disinfectant. I was guided into a small room with a single table, 2 chairs and a monitor mounted on the wall. "Sit." I did. The monitor flickered on. My own camera feed appeared on the screen, the same footage I had watched in real time hours earlier. The desert, the silhouettes, the family, every second of it played back in silence. I watched myself hesitate. I watched the moment I angled the helicopter. I watched the lights dim. I felt exposed, as if they weren't just reviewing the footage, but reviewing me. The video paused. One of the men leaned forward. "You experienced interference," he said flatly, "visual and cognitive." I said nothing. "You perceived movement that does not align with any verified assets in the area." Still nothing. He studied my face carefully, as if measuring my reaction rather than waiting for an answer. "The footage will be archived," he continued. "Certain segments will be removed. You will not discuss what you believe you saw. You will not reference this mission. You will not request clarification." "What if I already made a copy?" I asked before I could stop myself. The second man smiled slightly, not amused, not angry, just certain. "Then you would not be sitting here." Silence filled the room again. They stood, turned off the monitor, and left without another word. I was escorted back to the airstrip and released. No paperwork, no debrief, no warning. Just the clear, unspoken understanding that the conversation was over. For days afterward, nothing happened. No calls, no visits, no follow-ups. That bothered me more than threats ever could have. I reviewed my own equipment obsessively. The camera logs, the backups, everything appeared intact, except for one thing. There was a gap. 37 seconds of footage were missing, not corrupted, not overwritten, cleanly removed. I watched the surrounding frames again and again, trying to remember what I had seen during that missing time. I couldn't. It was like trying to recall a dream that evaporates the moment you wake up. But something else remained. A feeling, a lingering sense that something had been taken and something deliberately left behind. That night, as I lay awake in my apartment, I felt the same pressure return, lighter than before, subtle, almost gentle, not intrusive, reassuring. I don't know how else to describe it. No images came, no words, just a quiet certainty that the family had survived, that whatever path they had taken through the desert was not random, and that my role in it, however small, had mattered. I slept for the first time since the mission, and when I woke up I knew one thing for sure. They had erased what they wanted, but not everything. For weeks after the mission, life pretended to return to normal. I resumed routine flights, filed ordinary reports, exchanged small talk with mechanics and controllers who had no idea how close the desert had come to swallowing something extraordinary. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I became acutely aware of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of it, the way rooms felt heavier when no one else was around, the way my thoughts seemed slower, as if they were being gently observed rather than generated. I told myself it was stress, adrenaline withdrawal, the mind processing an intense experience. That explanation worked, until it didn't. The first incident happened late one night, about 2 weeks after the mission. I was reviewing flight logs at home when the lights flickered briefly. Power outages weren't uncommon, but this felt different. The flicker wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I froze. The room didn't go dark. Instead, everything became unusually still. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The distant sound of traffic vanished. It was as if the world had been muted. And then that pressure returned. Not overwhelming, not frightening, familiar. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever fragile balance had formed. My heart raced, but my mind was oddly calm. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, this is not a visit. It was a reminder. Images surfaced in my mind, not pictures, not memories, but impressions, open spaces, depth, distance measured not in miles, but in something broader, harder to define. I sensed movement far away, far beyond anything I could point to on a map. And then, just as suddenly it ended, the sounds returned. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. The lights stabilized. I checked the clock. Only a few seconds had passed, or so it seemed. That night, I dreamed of the desert, not as I had seen it from the air, but from ground level. The rocks towered above me, shadows stretched and folded into one another. Somewhere beyond my line of sight, I knew they were moving, not away, but onward. When I woke up, my bed sheets were damp with sweat, and my heart was pounding as if I'd been running. Similar moments followed over the next several days, brief disruptions, electrical anomalies, an inexplicable sense of presence that never crossed into fear. If anything, it felt watchful, protective. I didn't tell anyone, I couldn't. How do you explain something that never quite happens, yet leaves a mark every time? One evening, while cleaning out a storage drawer, I found something that made my breath catch. A small object resting between old cables and spare batteries, smooth, dark, warm to the touch. I didn't remember putting it there. It was no larger than a coin, shaped irregularly, with faint lines etched across its surface. Not writing, not symbols, more like pathways. I held it in my palm, and the familiar pressure bloomed softly behind my eyes. Understanding followed. Not words, but intent. This was not technology. It was a marker, a way of saying, you were there, you chose. I placed it back in the drawer and closed it gently, as if sudden movement might disturb something unseen. That night, I slept deeply, without dreams. From that moment on, the disturbances lessened. The pressure faded into something distant. The sense of being observed softened, like a presence stepping back after confirming what it needed to know. Months passed. No one contacted me, no files surfaced, no questions were asked. But I noticed changes in myself. My fear responses dulled. My empathy sharpened. I found it harder to accept simple explanations for complex things. The world felt larger, layered, filled with quiet intersections we rarely notice. I realized then that helping them hadn't ended the encounter. It had begun something else entirely, not a connection, a responsibility. And whatever came next, I knew it wouldn't arrive from the sky. It would arrive when I least expected it. Nearly a year passed before anything else happened. Long enough for routine to dull the sharpest edges of memory. Long enough for me to almost believe that the desert encounter had been an isolated anomaly, a convergence of stress, secrecy, and imagination amplified by isolation. almost. I had stopped flying government-adjacent contracts by then, quietly. No resignation letter, no explanation. I shifted to civilian charter work, short-haul flights, tourist routes, predictable, visible, safe. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The object remained in my apartment drawer. I never touched it again. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. The night everything changed again was unremarkable in every way that matters. I was flying a routine coastal route, well within civilian airspace, instruments calibrated, weather clear, the kind of flight you could perform half asleep. That was when the radio hissed. At first, I assumed interference from a passing storm system, even though the sky was clear. The sound wasn't static in the usual sense. It was layered, pulses within pulses, like multiple signals overlapping imperfectly. I adjusted frequencies. Nothing. The hiss intensified, then softened, then resolved into something that made my blood run cold. A pattern, not language, not music, but repetition, deliberate spacing, a cadence that felt intentional rather than random. My hands tightened on the controls as the pressure returned. Faint but unmistakable. I wasn't afraid. I was alert. The instruments began recording automatically. I hadn't activated anything manually, yet the data logs were filling rapidly. Altitude stable, speed constant. No visual anomalies. And yet every instinct I had was screaming that I was no longer alone in that airspace. Then came the certainty. Not spoken, not transmitted audibly. This is not for you. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning the horizon. Nothing unusual. No lights, no shadows, just ocean and sky meeting in a thin, glowing line. The radio signal shifted again. This time, it wasn't sound. It was silence. Complete, absolute silence across every channel simultaneously. I had never experienced that before. Even dead air has texture. This didn't. I felt the aircraft respond, not physically but perceptually, as if something external had brushed against the edges of my awareness. Images formed briefly in my mind, the desert rocks, the family moving into shadow, the taller figure turning back one last time. Then, something new appeared. Distance, vastness, movement that did not obey straight lines or familiar dimensions. I sensed a trajectory unfolding, not toward Earth, but away from it, a retreat rather than an advance. And then I understood. That night in the desert hadn't been an isolated event. It had been an evacuation. The pressure eased. The radio channels snapped back to life all at once, flooding the cockpit with normal noise. The aircraft systems normalized. The logs stopped recording as abruptly as they had started. I checked the clock. 7 minutes were missing, not skipped, not fast-forwarded, gone. I landed without incident, filed my report and went home. No one questioned the data gap. No alarms were triggered. If the anomaly had been noticed, it had been deliberately ignored. That night, I opened the drawer. The object was no longer warm. It was cold, lighter too, almost brittle. I held it up to the light and saw that the faint pathways on its surface had shifted, not rearranged, but completed, like a circuit closing. The pressure returned one final time, softer than ever. Almost affectionate. It is finished. I don't know how I knew what that meant, but I knew. Whatever presence had passed through our skies was gone now, not hidden, not watching, gone. And I had been allowed, intentionally, to witness its departure. The object crumbled into fine dust in my hand. I let it fall into the sink and washed it away without thinking. That was the last direct contact, or so I believed. After the signal and the missing 7 minutes, I tried to do what any rational person would do. I tried to forget. I told myself I was overfitting meaning to coincidence, stitching together anomalies because my mind couldn't tolerate a loose thread. I stayed busy. I flew my routes. I avoided late-night solitude. I didn't talk about the desert. I didn't talk about the radio. But forgetting didn't erase the fact that something had changed. Not in the sky, in me. There was a new sensitivity I couldn't turn off, a quiet awareness that systems can be manipulated without leaving fingerprints, that official records can be shaped like clay, that the truth can be hidden in plain sight, not by destroying it, but by exhausting the person who tries to hold it. Then the email arrived. No subject line, no sender name, just an address made of random characters and a single attachment labeled Flight 2003 AUX. My fingers hovered over the trackpad for a long time before I clicked. The file shouldn't have existed. I had reviewed my own logs 100 times, and anything connected to that night was supposed to be sealed behind layers of control I didn't have access to. The attachment was small, too small for a full flight record. It looked almost like a fragment. I opened it. At first it was unreadable. Lines of numbers, timestamps, sensor flags. Nothing that meant anything to a normal person. But I wasn't normal about this anymore. I knew what to look for. Gaps, overrides, signature markers that indicate tampering. And there it was. The missing 37 seconds. Not restored as video, restored as metadata. Coordinates, altitude, heading. A time block that had been erased from my camera feed but preserved in the flight system's hidden layer. Whoever sent the file wasn't giving me proof for the public. They were giving me confirmation for myself. My mouth went dry as I traced the coordinates. They were slightly different from where I remembered hovering, not by miles, but by enough to matter, enough to suggest I had drifted farther toward the rock formations than I believed, which meant the family had been closer to me than my memory allowed. Then I saw something that made my skin prickle. A second set of coordinates embedded beneath the first, as if the file had been written twice, once by my aircraft and once by something else. The numbers didn't fit standard GPS formats. The intervals were wrong. The sequence didn't map cleanly onto a linear path. It looked like an alternate route, not a destination, a corridor. I stared at the screen for a long time, barely breathing. The longer I looked, the more the pattern felt familiar, not intellectually but emotionally, like recognizing a face you haven't seen since childhood. A message formed in my mind, quiet and unforced. This is where they went. I pushed my chair back and stood up too quickly, as if distance from the monitor could reduce the weight of what I was seeing. My hands were trembling. I told myself this was impossible, that it had to be a prank, a fabricated file, a hack. But deep down, I knew something else. No one pranks you with precision like that. I printed the page, then I stopped. Paper could be taken, digital files could be wiped, anything I did could be traced. And I was no longer sure whether the sender was helping me or testing me. That night, I slept with the laptop closed, as if shutting it could shut out the implications. I dreamed again of the desert, but this time, I wasn't in the helicopter. I was on foot, walking toward the rocks, hearing rotors overhead, feeling heat bursts from distant flares. In the dream, the taller figure looked back at me, and for the first time I understood the emotion behind that gaze. Not fear, not gratitude, urgency mixed with trust. When I woke up, my phone had one missed call, no number, no voicemail. And in the sink, where I had washed away the dust of the object months earlier, there was a faint residue clinging to the porcelain like glitter. I rubbed it between my fingers. It wasn't dust, it was granular, like fine sand. But it shimmered under the light in a way sand never does. That was when I realized the most unsettling truth yet. I hadn't been released from the story. I had simply been allowed to live between chapters. I didn't call the number back. There was no number to call, and even if there had been, I knew better than to chase shadows in the open. I did what I'd learned to do back when I still took grey contracts. I watched. I waited. I changed nothing about my routine in a way that would look deliberate, but I tightened every habit that kept me difficult to track. Still, the feeling of being observed returned, subtle at first, like a draft you can't locate, I'd walk into a room and sense that I was arriving a second too late, as if something had just withdrawn. I'd open my laptop and notice the cursor already blinking in a blank document I didn't remember creating. Small things, easy to dismiss, impossible to fully ignore. 3 nights after the email, I heard the first unmistakable sound. A helicopter, not the distant thrum you hear over a city. This was close enough that the windows vibrated. I moved to the living room and looked through the blinds. There was nothing outside, no spotlight, no navigation lights, no shadow crossing the street. But the sound was there, rotors cutting air with disciplined steadiness. The same tone I'd heard in the desert, the same rhythm. My heart kicked hard. I reached for my phone, then stopped. Calling anyone would turn this into something real on a record I didn't control. Instead, I turned off every light in the apartment and waited in the dark, like I'd been taught. The rotor sound faded, replaced by silence so heavy it felt physical. And then, one single knock at my door. Not pounding, not aggressive, measured, professional, like someone who expected compliance. I didn't move. A second knock followed, identical in force and spacing. I stayed still, listening for footsteps, voices, the rustle of clothing. Nothing, just that quiet pressure behind my eyes, the same sensation I'd felt in the desert, except now it carried a different tone. Not urgency, warning. I walked to the kitchen, keeping my steps slow to avoid creating any audible rhythm. I took a glass from the cabinet, something ordinary to hold, something to anchor my hands, and approached the door. I didn't touch the handle. I didn't speak. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No men in plain clothes, no uniforms, no boots, no shadow. My skin prickled. The hairs along my arms rose in unison, as if responding to an electrical field. I stepped back. And that's when I noticed the smell. Ozone. The same sterile metallic scent from the concrete building near the auxiliary strip. It wasn't strong, but it was unmistakable, like air after a lightning strike, except there had been no storm. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A notification. No sound, no banner preview. Just a blank vibration, as if the device had been forced to acknowledge something without revealing it. I opened the screen. A single line appeared in my Notes app, a note I had never created. Do not go to the coordinates. I stared at it until my eyes watered. Then, right beneath that line, another sentence appeared, typed letter by letter as if someone were composing it live. You are not the only one who received the file. My mouth went dry. I backed away from the door, keeping the phone in front of me like a shield. The pressure behind my eyes intensified for a moment, and with it came something like a flicker of understanding. Not words, not images, but the shape of a situation. Multiple recipients, multiple witnesses, multiple chances for someone to make the wrong move. The rotor sound returned briefly, one low sweep, then disappeared again, leaving behind the normal noises of the building, a distant TV, a neighbor's footsteps, plumbing, ordinary life rushing back in like water filling a drained pool. I looked at the phone again. The note was gone, deleted, not archived, not moved. Gone. I checked recently deleted. Nothing. My hands shook as I locked the phone and set it down on the counter. I stood there listening, waiting for another knock that never came. Minutes passed, then an hour. I began to think it was over, until I noticed the smallest detail of all. On the floor by the door, where the hallway light spilled in under the frame, there was a thin line of pale grit, like sand, like the residue I'd seen in my sink. But this grit was arranged too neatly to be accidental. A curve, a break, a second curve. Not a symbol I could translate, just a pattern that looked like a path interrupted on purpose. I didn't touch it. I didn't photograph it. I didn't even step over it, because the message was clear without needing interpretation. Someone had come to my door without ever being there, and whoever or whatever was guiding this story had just pushed me to the edge of a decision I was no longer sure I could avoid. I didn't sleep after the knock that never happened. I sat in the dark with my back against the wall, watching the thin line of pale grit by the door like it might move on its own. Morning arrived slowly, turning my apartment into something that looked normal again. Sunlight, noise, people leaving for work. But I wasn't normal anymore. Not after the note that appeared and vanished. Not after the warning. Not after the realization that I wasn't the only one holding a piece of the same secret. By noon, I had made a decision. I would not go to the coordinates. Not yet. If someone wanted me there, they could lure me. If someone wanted to stop me, they could frighten me. Either way, rushing in would make me predictable. So I did something else. I returned to the one thing I trusted more than any message: my own records. I dug through an old hard drive I kept sealed in a metal box, overkill to most people, but pilots learned to respect redundancy. Inside were archived logs, maintenance records, even copies of personal flight footage I'd saved over the years. Most of it was boring, the kind of data that proves a life happened. And then I found it. A folder dated the week after the desert mission. I didn't remember creating it, but the timestamp matched a time when I'd been half paranoid and running on no sleep. The folder contained 3 files. 2 were corrupted. The third was labeled with a name that made my throat tighten. AUX, CAM, Backup, 2003, Final. I stared at that file name for a long time before opening it, as if looking too directly might erase it. Then I clicked. The video loaded. The cockpit view appeared, grainy, low light but stable, the desert below, the rock formations, the flares in the distance. My own breathing audible in the microphone, fast and shallow. The camera angle shifted slightly as the helicopter drifted, and for a moment I thought the file would end exactly where my memory always ended, an empty shadow where the family had been. But it didn't. The playback continued into the 37 seconds that had been missing. The screen showed the rock line, and then movement. Not a run, not a scramble, a controlled retreat into darkness like they were stepping into a doorway only they could see. The 3 smaller figures vanished first, swallowed by the shadow without a sound. Then the taller one remained. It stood alone at the edge of the light, half visible, half erased. It didn't panic. It didn't rush. It turned its head upward, directly toward the helicopter, directly toward the camera. I felt the same stomach drop I'd felt in the air that night, except now there was nowhere to hide from it. The footage was too clear to deny. It was real enough to make my skin go cold. The figure lifted one hand, not like a warning, not like a threat, like a farewell, a slow, deliberate gesture that carried something heavy in its simplicity. As if it understood how permanent this moment would be for me, even if it lasted only a second. Then, the impossible part happened. The camera's audio spiked, a brief burst of distortion, and beneath it, so faint I almost missed it, there was a sound that wasn't a voice, but wasn't silence either. A tonal vibration, like air moving through a narrow space. It lasted less than a heartbeat. And my body reacted to it before my mind did. My eyes burned, my chest tightened. I felt a sudden rush of emotion I couldn't justify. Grief, relief, recognition, all braided together. I don't claim it was language. I don't claim I understood it in a human way, but I understood the meaning. You did enough. The taller figure stepped backward into the shadow, and the darkness closed like water. The video ended. I sat motionless, staring at the frozen black frame. My hands were shaking so hard, I had to press my palms flat against my knees to steady them. I replayed the last 10 seconds again and again, searching for proof of editing, searching for artifacts, searching for anything that would let me dismiss it. There was nothing to dismiss. I hadn't imagined the farewell. I hadn't imagined the family. And I hadn't imagined that someone, somehow, had allowed this fragment to survive. That was the surprise, the part that took me years to accept. They hadn't erased everything because they couldn't. They hadn't erased everything because they didn't want to. Someone wanted me to have that last second. Someone wanted me to remember the difference between a target and a family. Someone wanted me to carry the only kind of evidence that matters when official evidence disappears, a moment that changes you. I closed the laptop and locked the metal box again. Not because I was afraid of being caught, because I understood finally that this wasn't about exposing a secret. It was about guarding a truth that couldn't survive the wrong hands. I never went to the coordinates, and I never received another file. But sometimes, late at night, when the world goes quiet in that unnatural way, I feel that familiar pressure behind my eyes, lighter than before, almost like a passing breeze. And I know, without needing to see them again, that somewhere beyond the reach of our maps and our orders, they made it out. They survived, and the last thing they left me was not proof, it was mercy. If this story made you think, like the video to help it reach more people, subscribe so you don't miss the next testimony, and comment desert if you stayed until the very end, and tell us where you're listening from right now.